Good evening. I want to welcome you back to our Commands of Christ sermon series. And tonight we will be looking at the 10th commandment. And the title of my message is We Need to Love Our Enemies, which comes out of the passage of Matthew chapter 5, verses 44 to 46. I want to backtrack just one quick verse and go to start with Matthew 5:43 and go through 46, where Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." One of my favorite movies is Kingdom of Heaven, starring Orlando Bloom and Eva Green. The plot is set in the Crusades of the 12th century, pitting Christians in Jerusalem, defending themselves against a pending Muslim takeover. And in the movie, a Christian blacksmith named Balian is confronted by a Muslim cavalier in the desert who attacks him for his horse. Balian is forced to slay the cavalier in order to keep his horse, and he has the opportunity to also kill the man's servant. Now, Balian is standing over this Muslim's servant with a sword in his hand, and the man on the ground asking him to kill him. Yet Balian opts to spare the man's life. Now, fast forward and to the movie later on, the man, it turns out, that was on the ground, the servant, is found out to be the chancellor of the Sultan. Before leaving Balian, the servant that was left alive turned on his horse, looked at Balian, and said, "Your quality will be known amongst your enemies wherever or before ever you meet them." The movie progresses. There's a later scene where these two men encounter each other again. And this time the scripts are flipped. And you know what happens, probably could guess. This time the chancellor releases Balian. See, I love this scene because it shows us there are times when it pays off to love our enemies, to treat them with respect, no matter who they are, no matter what they look like, no matter what religion they may claim. What comes around goes around, and in this case, Balian's good deed ended up saving his hide. Now, this movie scene, it may not represent the immediate context or implied meaning that Jesus is getting at in this passage in the Sermon on the Mount. However, I think it still holds some value. I think there comes a point in war, especially in wars that drag on, where men begin to realize they may have more in common with their enemy that they're fighting against than in the differences they share with their enemy. In wars where troops aren't sure why they are fighting, general combat troops from both sides begin to realize they're simply doing whatever their commanding officers tell them to do. They don't even think about it. Whether that's right, wrong, or indifferent, they're just obeying orders at that point. And when that happens, they're able to process in their mind that they come to a point where they can realize the enemy is just a man like they are, with a weapon in his hand. I guess we could say her hand now, being told to do whatever they're being told to do and doing it. See, we can see this realization even in our own nation's history. Historian Scott Culpepper writes, "The influence of faith in the American Civil War was complicated. As Lincoln so astutely observed, both sides prayed to the same God. Both sides believed that God heard them and supported their cause. Lincoln and many others adopted a more complex view, acknowledging that there was both righteousness and unrighteousness on both sides. They believed that in the end, though they might catch glimpses of the divine purpose, the ways and will of God are ultimately inscrutable in human affairs. A survey of religious views during the American Civil War provides a healthy reminder that separating the will of God from man's will and the ways of God from man's cultural assumptions is no easy task. I also can share with you a couple examples of humanity shining through the darkness of war, or we could say wars, but that occurred during, let's start with World War I. War has a way of drawing humanity in only when the enemy sides can take enough time to lay their respective weapons down. It's said that in World War I that German and Allied soldiers paused long enough to celebrate Christmas together. Called Christmas time, 1914, or in the Christmas truce, it is said that the opposing sides, fighting against each other, laid down their weapons and played football on Christmas Day. They sang Christmas carols and they even exchanged gifts before going back to shooting one another the next day. They found their common ground amongst so many differences. Also in World War I, it's documented that Australian soldiers traded biscuits and cigarettes with the Turks. You see that? You get that? There's two enemies taking a mutual break from one another to share food. War's complex, and it's only in the complexities of war that one can come to understand how much he really has in common with his fellow man. I think this realization is some of what Jesus is getting at when he says that his Father makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and on the unjust. Now let's try to get down to what Jesus is really saying here when he commanded us as his disciples to love our enemies. The Old Testament not only commanded Jewish people to love people, but to love their neighbor as themselves. The scribes and Pharisees, they came along and omitted that as yourself part and actually added the part hate your enemy. Both their omission and their addition of Scripture were evil. When Jesus said to love your enemy as yourself, he took this command to the heart level of an individual. Jesus wasn't primarily talking about wars or nations fighting nations here. No, Jesus wants you to love even your neighbors who hate you. The scribes and Pharisees, that they had perverted the love of God and provided exceptions to the rule, allowing them not to love. There are no exceptions when it comes to us loving others with God's love. The love that God commands us of His people is so great that it even embraces one's personal enemies. William Hendrickson says this about the love of Jesus. All around Him were those walls and fences. He came for the very purpose of bursting those barriers so that love, pure, warm, divine, infinite, would be able to flow straight down from the heart of God, hence from His own marvelous heart into the hearts of men. His love overleaped all the boundaries of race, nationality, party, age, sex. When He said, I tell you, love your enemies, He must have startled His audience, for He was saying something that probably never before had been said so succinctly, positively, and forcefully. R.C.H. Linsky likewise writes, I cannot, like a low, mean criminal who may have robbed me and threatened my life, I cannot, he said he cannot like someone like that. He says, I cannot like a false, lying, slanderous fellow who perhaps has vilified me again and again, but I can, by the grace of Jesus Christ, love them all. See what is wrong with them, desire and work to do them only good, most of all to free them from their vicious way. See, your enemy may come to you in the form of even your spouse, your children, your parents, your friends, your fellow church members, your business rival, your sports rival, your political foe, you're a spiteful person, but your attitude toward them should be one of prayerful love. From their perspective, you are their enemy. But from your perspective, they are your neighbor. They're your friend. Once again, however, I think we Christians often miss the main gist of this passage. Jesus says we're to love our enemies in the context of those who are persecuting us in His name. This is why Jesus says to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. More than physical warfare fought between nations and people, there's a spiritual warfare. It's happening, and it often goes unseen. In praying for those who persecute us, we're showing the world that we are true sons of God. We're the peacemakers, remember? God Himself is love, and the greatest evidence of our divine sonship through Jesus Christ is our love for one another. We need to offer this type of loving witness to a watching world. John MacArthur says this: one of the most commonest and most damaging criticisms of Christianity is the charge that Christians do not live up to their faith. Even though the world has a limited and often distorted idea of what the gospel is, they know enough about the teachings of Christ to realize that most people who go by His name do not do all that He has commanded and do not live as He lived. Powerful statement there. And it really should hit us in the heart. It really hits home. As Christ followers, we're to love what God loves. We're to hate what God hates. We're to remember that we too were once enemies of Christ, rebels that Jesus laid down His life for, so that we might become His sons, His friends. Only God has the right to love conditionally. As His children, we're commanded, we are to love unconditionally. Michael Wilkins defines love as an unconditional commitment to an imperfect person in which I give myself to bring the relationship to God's intended purpose. Man, I love that quote. I'm going to read it again. Michael Wilkins defines love as an unconditional commitment to an imperfect person in which I give myself to bring the relationship to God's intended purpose. So what do we do with this dangerous, devious forces at work in our day that range from ultra-right-wing patriot militias and ethnic supremacists to ultra-left-wing gay activists and political anarchists? We do not like or agree with what they stand for or what they do, but we must choose to love them. In their humanity, we love them as people made in God's image. It's for these that Jesus died on the cross for too. The virtue that corresponds to our command this week is the virtue called creativity. I know I normally save this section for the end of the message, but I want to bring it up right now. Webster's dictionary says to create something is to bring it into existence, to produce it through imaginative skill. So we've got to be creative by coming up with some creative ways to show love to our enemies. Maybe we don't make them pay the full account on an item. Maybe we go out of our way to welcome them. Maybe we surprise them with a gift. I don't know. But I know there are many creative ways to show love to our enemies if we'll only pray and think about such things. And more than praying, we must then go out and we must do these things. We must live it out in public. I want to finish my sermon tonight by reading you a rather lengthy article written by Thomas Christensen in Relevant magazine titled, "What It Actually Means to Love Your Enemies." Now, I want to read you this article not because I agree with everything in the article, but because I think it sums up quite nicely on what I preached about last week, this week, and the week to come. Christensen writes, "How much do you love the members of ISIS? Or the latest person who shot up a school or church or a movie theater?" That question may seem absurd, and maybe it is. I think love your enemies is the most unreasonable thing Jesus says. And that's saying something, because it's coming from a guy who also says stuff like, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood, hate your mother and father, and sell all your possessions and give the money to the poor." John 6:56, Luke 14:26, and Matthew 19:21, respectively. But love your enemies? Come on! And this is more than just the inconsiderate jerks who pop up occasionally in your life. We're not just talking about the guy at work who keeps stealing your lunch, or the lady who cut you off on the highway and then gave you the finger. Jesus and his audience lived under an oppressive, occupying Roman government. The Romans employed torture and murder to keep people in line. Everyone listening to Jesus talk about this love your enemies stuff had plenty of opportunities to experience, "I hate you with every ounce of my guts," enemies in the soldiers and prefects that had carried out this daily social domination. As I read about the latest shooting or the latest beheading, my natural response is to dehumanize the people who do these things. I think of them as monsters or demons or something else that allows me to pretend that they are not fellow humans. But that's not true. Each one was born. Each one has a mother and a father. They eat, they drink, they have personal stories and experiences full of pain and joy. They are human. And if I take the narrative of the Bible to be true, they are fellow children of God. They are loved by God. I want to be very clear. I'm not supporting or accepting of terrorism or mass shootings. I'm also not arguing against legal consequences for those actions. But if I hate the people who undertake these actions, I am not hating monsters or demons. I'm hating fellow humans. Some are suffering from mental illness or from personal anguish or from religious manipulation. In the midst of grief and anger for those who suffer, can I not spare some compassion for those who have missed out on the life filled with grace and hope that Jesus has called all of us to live? We like to live in a binary black and white world where everyone is basically good or bad. But life isn't so cut and dried. Someone can be guilty of terrible things and still deserve compassion. I'm not seeking to humanize terrorists and murderers because they deserve it or because I'm ignoring their actions. I'm seeking to humanize them because it's true. It is also the only way we can hope to stem the tide of terrorism and shootings at schools and malls and workplaces and houses of worship. Because if these actions are the work of monsters and demons, I'm powerless to stop them. I can only shake my head and feel sad that such beings cannot be stopped. But if I'm dealing with humans, I can have hope. Hope that messages of love and acceptance and peace can be heard. Hope that God can redeem even the worst of sinners. Hope that God can redeem my deep, dark sins too. I look to the examples like the Civil Rights Movement and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in post-apartheid South Africa, where I see clearly that only when we treat our adversaries as humans, no matter how flawed, can we hope to prevail in our cause, the cause of ultimate justice. The belief that God will eventually set all the wrongs to right. As Miroslav Volf says in Exclusion and Embrace, if you want justice and nothing but justice, you will inevitably get injustice. If you want justice without injustice, you must want love. Much more could be said on the topic of justice, but that is perhaps for another time. If you've been willing to go with me this far, perhaps you're willing to ask the next question. How do I love my enemies? Pray for your enemies. I'm not talking about please give that person what they have coming to them prayers, but I also don't mean that you need to spend an hour each night asking God to pour blessings on them. There's a way to pray both for justice and for the hearts of those committing injustices. If you have hate in your heart for somebody, maybe it starts with God. I hate that person and I don't want to. As C.S. Lewis has said, prayer doesn't change God, it changes me. Praying for your enemy opens you up to the work of the Holy Spirit in your heart. Martin Luther King Jr. in Strength to Love posits that forgiveness is the decisive factor in how much you can love your enemy. I fully agree. When Jesus looks at his executioners from the cross and offers forgiveness, can there be any doubt of his love for them? When relatives of the victims in the South Carolina church shooting offered forgiveness to the young man who murdered their loved ones, could anyone doubt that they were seeking to take Jesus' words and examples seriously? Loving your enemy does not mean you have to add them to your Christmas list or make them your best friend. It doesn't mean you excuse their actions. It means you forgive them with the knowledge that God is both merciful and just. Jesus faced grave injustice with sacrifice. Through prayer and forgiveness in our hearts, let us go forth to conquer injustice in our time by the courage not to demand retribution, but rather to repay injury with blessing and hate with love.